everybody. Welcome back to the Wisdom Tradition Podcast. This is Alex Sakin. In today's episode, I am excited to be introducing my new book that's going to be forthcoming. It'll be out in a few weeks. It's going to be called The Coming World Nation, and the subtitle is Why the Endgame of American Empire is Global Government. And the contents of this book are based on a revised and expanded version of the series I did last year called The Secret History of the 20th Century. So I took the core structure of that series and I rewrote it, or most of it, following in many instances the same sequence of arguments that I made in that book or in that earlier series, which was published on my Substack and in serialized form on my podcast. I rewrote it, like every piece of it, or in some cases significantly re-edited the material that I originally put out. And I also expanded it and brought it up to present day. I added a few different chapters, new chapters. I merged a couple of the old ones together. And so this is an important work in my career and in the trajectory of this podcast and Substack. And I'm very excited to be presenting it with you. A lot of my work in the past has been based on the work of Manly P. Hall and going through the decades of work that he put out and kind of reorganizing that material and showing how in his teachings of esoteric philosophy, how the history of civilization evolves, but also going into the spiritual cosmology of creation. And those are things I'm still going to be dealing with in the future. And there's a little bit of influence of that in this book, but the majority of the contents of this present work are actually not based on the work of Manly Hall, but in my own research that I put together over the course of around 15 years. I was trained as a social scientist in university, both on undergrad and graduate level. And so this book is really an expression of that. It's partly a work of history, it's partly a work of sociology, and then there is a heavy philosophical influence in the work. And you're going to see that influence come out in this introduction, which I'm going to share with you today. So today I'm going to be reading out the introduction to this book, and it's called The Kali Yuga Reaches Its Grand Finale. That's the title of the introduction. And I've spent the majority of the past year working on this book. I actually did work behind the scenes on another book with Aubrey Marcus, and that project wrapped a couple months ago. And that book will be out next year. It's going to be called You vs. Anti-You. And I'll get into more on that later. But this past year, I haven't done as much with the podcast and Substack as I had done in previous years. And that'll change in the future. But I really have been putting so much time into this book and getting this ready. And I have some other excerpts I'm going to be sharing from it with you over the course of the coming weeks. I plan on having this out on Amazon in a few weeks' time. I still want to do one more read through and re-edit of the book. And then once that's done, I'm going to get it formatted and get it up on Amazon. And then I'll finally be able to share it with you. And I'm really excited about this. So this is an important book, not just in my career, but also I think very timely in terms of its release. And the themes are very relevant to today. And what my attempt has been is to really advance on a number of different fronts, advance the arguments and advance the state of understanding about the world at this time that we're entering into that's marked by transformative changes taking place in the world. So without further ado, I want to jump into the introduction. Actually, before I do that, let me read you out the table of contents for this book. So it begins with the introduction, and then there's three main sections. The first section is called The Origin of American Empire. The second is called The Birth of the Technocratic Superstate. And then the third section is called The Transition to Global Government. And again, the subtitle explains the overarching thesis of the book, which is why the end game of American empire is global government. And the idea here is that American empire, the story of American empire is really the dominant catalyst of things that are taking place in the world and has been over the past century plus. So if you want to understand modern history, your analysis has to be rooted in the story of American empire. And as I explore in this book, the structure of American empire is a lot more complex than what it may originally appear to be. It may originally appear to be just a extractive sort of capitalistic empire, a progression of the British Empire. And that's actually is an aspect of American Empire, and it's the one that I cover in this first section called The Origin of American Empire. I talk about that aspect of American Empire, and it is very much an important property of understanding why America exists the way it does, how it behaved, why it behaves the way it does, how it emerged originally from a nation state and moved into an empire. So that is what we cover in the beginning, and a lot of that story plays out in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. But then in the second section called The Birth of the Technocratic Superstate, I talk about how this other aspect of American Empire emerged. And this is one that people really don't understand very well, and many people overlook it. And I think that that's a fatal flaw in trying to understand why American Empire exists in the way that it does and why it behaves in the world in the way that it does, is that they're not factoring in this depth dimension to the American Empire. And this depth dimension has to do with the world of black projects. It has to do with the emergence of an aspect that is not capitalistic, but is technocratic. And this story also goes back to the late 19th and early 20th centuries, but really concentrates around a series of pivotal events that took place around World War II and in the initial years following World War II. So in the first section, The Origin of American Empire, I focus in on the early decades of the 20th century and the later eras of the 19th century. And then, so I move up to World War II. And then in The Birth of the Technocratic Superstate, the second section of the book, I go back in time, revisit the period of the late 19th and early 20th century, but then show how there was this other story that was also gradually building during this period, and how this moves forward and really culminates in World War II and this whole secret hidden aspect of World War II that is absolutely pivotal to understand what happened in this war and why it existed, and also crucially how it changed America and how America went on this new pattern after World War II. And so that's what the second part of the book is about. It's about introducing how technocracy emerged and this whole black projects world emerged. And I combine those concepts of technocracy and black projects, whole infrastructure of black projects, and that becomes what I call the technocratic superstate. And then the third section of the book really focuses on the period after World War II and talks about how this period marked the formal birth of American Empire, and there was outwardly a capitalistic aspect to this empire, and this is the one that we're most familiar with when we look at the behavior of American Empire. This is what someone like John Perkins would talk about in his book, Confessions of an Economic Hitman. This is the aspect that controls the World Bank, controls the international institutions, the UN, that has its military extended throughout the world, and engages in wars like Vietnam or the Iraq War. So this is one aspect of American Empire. This is also the aspect of like the CIA and these sort of intelligence agencies that are murky, but you can still kind of get an idea about what they are and how they operate. But then as the American Empire builds out, there's also this hidden world of black projects, and there's all this whole mystery about UFOs and what role does that play in the US national security state. So those are the things I get into in this last section. It's called The Transition to Global Government. And then I bring it up to present day, and I talk about how the crises of the current moment are really representing the final death process of the American Empire and its plan to eventually rebirth itself into a system of global government. And, this is just my analysis of history. It's not, do I want this to happen? Do I think it's good that it's happening? Am I justifying it? Am I supporting it? For me, those aren't really relevant factors. As a social scientist, my job is to present a model of history and a model of sociology that describes accurately the world that we live in and the world that we're inhabiting. And then the philosophic side of me comes in and tries to add in some elements of sort of spiritual concepts and to try to extract meaning and purpose to this whole process that we can take in today. So really try to articulate a vision that's built out of this model of history and model of sociology, a vision that will hopefully inspire us to come together to make this coming global civilization, coming system of global government, to infuse a sense of spiritual inspiration into it, and to make sure that there's something new that emerges with this new paradigm of government. So in that sense, what I try to do in this book is offer a vision, a shaping vision that can hopefully bring a lot of different groups together and inspire them to want to come together in pursuit of a higher ideal. Because I think the move towards global government is inevitable, and it's also archetypal. In the beginning of recorded history, we start off as many different separate tribes and then gradually states, just separate from each other, disunited throughout the world. We can say that going way back into prehistory, there was once a global civilization that we term Atlantis. But after the deluge, after the collapse, there was a balkanization of the world, and there was a separation of cultures and peoples. And then gradually over time, tribes form into states, and the states interlink together and form these sort of regional empires. And then gradually over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries, large swaths of the world have been economically connected and politically connected. And now we're sitting on the cusp of once again, a global civilization. So I think that this is a long-term evolutionary trajectory that we're on. It's not under the control of any individual. It's an archetype that mankind is being pulled forward into. And I do talk about in the book some of the ideas of larger cosmic cycles playing out, how it makes sense at this current moment, how we're moving into this new phase of global government, how it marks a critical period astrologically and astronomically in terms of cycles. Like, this is the appropriate time for that to be taking place, and how the world as a whole is archetypally being drawn towards this end state, and how whether we like it or not, this is the path for human beings to go into. And so by offering this kind of reimagining of history, I want to offer a new vision for this global civilization that's to come, and one that can be inspiring to lots of different groups of people. So that's really the underlying goal of the book, is to look at this system of global government. Rather, most people look at it and they only talk about the shadow side of it, and I do deal with the shadow side of it in this book, but I also sort of uniquely try to illustrate the light side of it and the larger archetypal themes of it, and the idea that it's part of a spiritual evolutionary process, the unfoldment of spirit within the world through humanity. So real quick, let me just go through the various chapters of the book. So again, the first part of the book is called The Origin of American Empire. There's 4 chapters. The first one's How Capitalism Changed America. The second one is called World War I, A Conspiracy of Interests. Chapter 3 is called The Industrial Age and the Politics of Energy. And chapter 4 is called The Great Depression and the Build-Up to World War II. And again, that focuses on the capitalistic side of American history and how oligarchy first emerged as a power structure within America. So that leads the way to the second section, which is called The Birth of the Technocratic Superstate. So that begins with chapter 5, which is the classified science of Nikola Tesla. Then chapter 6 is called Technocracy, Government in the Scientific Age. This is one of those new chapters that I added. And this is basically a sociological assessment of technocracy. And it argues that it didn't emerge as an ideology. It emerged as a natural response to a series of events that occurred that had to do with the breakthrough scientific discovery of etheric energy during the 19th century. That out of necessity, that discovery forced a new paradigm of government to be created, one that could responsibly harness this energy source, and which would eventually be the form of government required to put this into use. The etheric energy paradigm has not been put to use yet, other than sporadically at different sectors of this black projects world. But we don't have it in public society yet. But this is coming as part of the global system of global government that's coming. At least that's what I argue in the book. So technocracy is the version of government that's required to implement an economy grounded in etheric energy. And that's what I talk about in this chapter. And I also outline the various components of technocracy. So that's chapter 6. Chapter 7 is called The Hidden Agenda Behind World War II. Chapter 8 is called An Empire of Secrecy. And this goes into delving into the implications of what happens when you have a society and a government that's so compartmentalized and so possessed by a culture of secrecy. What happens behaviorally to that system? And it ends up acting in a way in the same type of neurotic psychotic way that a person does, whose own sense of self-identity is completely compartmentalized, and there's all types of shadow complexes being repressed within it. So you get a very neurotic person. And so that's what happened to America as a result of this Black Projects world, and the need to maintain secrecy within that. I talk about the implications of what happens to the outer branches of empire, and how they're sort of let loose to cause chaos in the world because of this need to preserve secrecy within the inner core. So this is adding a level of complexity to understanding the behavior of American empire that you won't find in other analysis of it. So this is one of the unique contributions of this book, is to really psychoanalyze the American empire. And then the last chapter of this second section of the book is called The Untold Story of the Nazi Wonder Weapons. And this has to do with how the build out of this whole Black Projects world took place within America. And I argue that a series of circumstances was set up by these sort of technocratic masterminds within America that formed around the turn of the century, the turn of the 20th century, how they set up a situation where Nazi Germany would be the original society to begin to experiment with creating a permanent Black Projects world, and with one that would be based on etheric energy. But Nazi Germany only got to a rudimentary form of creating this kind of structure, and then the war ended, and then this whole infrastructure was harvested back into America. And then that became the seed out of which this whole Black Projects world grew out in America. And I argue that this didn't happen just by chance. It was a deliberate, sort of ingenious strategic program that was implemented. And that's how we wrap up the second section, again, that's called The Birth of the Technocratic Superstate. And then the third and last section of the book, again, is called The Transition to Global Government. And so this is completely rooted in the study of the Pax Americana, the American empire that was planned by various stakeholders. On one side, the Rockefellers, and on the other side, this deep technocratic entity, which is secret from even the Rockefellers. This is the Black Projects world that is its own separate, autonomous, independent entity that's concealed within the structure of American empire. How they also had their plans to establish a post-war American empire, and so the Cold War facilitated this process, and then the sort of key infrastructure of it was established through the establishment of the petrodollar system. So I talk about that in chapter 10. Chapter 11 goes into the shadow economy and the black budget, and that's underneath the surface of the petrodollar is this whole Black Projects world, and that has to be funded by something. It has to get its resources somehow, and so that's where the shadow economy and the black budget comes in. Then chapter 12 is called the UFO, an instrument of social engineering. So this is a revised version of what was originally the final chapter in my series on the 20th century. That was originally called the UFO, a symbol of initiation. So I restructured this chapter. Now it's called an instrument of social engineering, and I talk about how I think the UFO was used by the Black Projects world within the deep state as a means to gradually manipulate and sort of socially engineer the outer structures of the U.S. national security state. And so the work of someone like Richard Dolan's really influential here, because he wrote a series of books called UFOs in the National Security State that talk about the history of the national security state's interface with this topic and how it gradually changed and transformed over time in response to this UFO issue. And so part of this is actually becoming apparent now and being revealed through the slow drip revelation of the UFO mystery that's happened since 2017, where now you're having a series of whistleblowers come out and talk about the fact that the national security state has indeed been closely affected or deeply affected by the UFO mystery. And I talk about how that the UFO has actually been deliberately used in this manner as a means of change management or inspiring change or catalyzing change in a certain direction by the inner sector to the outer sector of American empire, the inner sector being the Black Project world. So it's an instrument of social engineering, I argue, and it's being used to basically move the national security state in the direction of technocracy and preparing it to one day fulfill a function in the system of global government that's being built as this sort of technocratic infrastructure of what that global government will be. So right now, the technocracy is being nested within American empire, but once American empire sort of dies and then is reborn as global government, this technocratic infrastructure will then be the key infrastructure that will manage the use of etheric energy technologies within global society. That's my theory. So I present that in that chapter. And then the final chapter is called The Return of the Mystery Schools. And it talks about how behind this whole pattern of empire and geopolitics that a lot of the book is based around, how there's this esoteric side to things, and the existence of, I argue, there exists a mystery school at the heart of this Black Projects world, and so the revelation of global government and the revelation of etheric energy technologies and the revelation of this whole Black Projects world, this technocratic superstate, as I call it, will coincide actually with the revelation of this mystery school, which has actually been the real power structure behind not only American empire, but behind the whole entirety of human history. And this is like really where the influence of Manly Hall comes back in, and because that's his thesis throughout his work, is that there is a spiritual institution in the world and always has been, and this spiritual institution is populated by people who have evolved themselves to a point of spiritual awakening. And once you become spiritually awakened, you become like the Bodhisattva. You are sort of in between two worlds. You know, the orientation of your consciousness is now in the spirit world, but you have this sacred duty to not abandon the rest of mankind, but to facilitate its long-term evolution. But your responsibility does not include taking the need for experience away from the rest of humanity. They have to undergo their own initiations, trial by fire, so to speak. They have to go through the experience of life to grow themselves in the same way that you once did to reach the state that you're in, talking from the standpoint of these bodhisattvas. So there's this idea that there's great suffering in the world. At the same time, there is a spiritual institution and there are enlightening beings. And there certainly is a divine hierarchy that culminates in the universal being, the universal self. And so there is suffering. At the same time, there is a higher order. And to deal with that complexity, why is there suffering and there's God? We have to understand the nature and the need for experience, and how this whole world is really a platform for one great consciousness to have an experience of itself. So it's in this way, the idea is that Earth is a great temple of initiation, but initiation is the process by which this one consciousness, which has moved its consciousness into creation to inhabit the individual consciousnesses of the various life forms on the planet, how through initiation, particularly the human life form, gradually comes to a reawakening of itself. And so this is the idea of God reawakening within his creation. And then once it reawakens, like the alchemist, it can perfect it and bring it to completion. So that's the role that mankind is collectively the alchemist. And that's what we have to learn, how the trajectory of our evolution is to discover this about ourselves and then to perform this act on behalf of God, because actually we are God. So the function of the mystery schools is to train mankind to become the alchemist. It's a divine institution in charge of human evolution, but it doesn't take away our own suffering. So that's the key thing. Its job is not to take away human suffering, because human suffering is also occurring within the context of cycles of rebirth and reincarnation. And so there actually is no final death. And there's this whole thing about karma that's woven into it, how karma has to play itself out like cause and effect. And that this is something I talk about in the book, how the crises that we're experiencing at the present moment are heavily impregnated with karmic implications from our past. And I talk a lot about the Kali Yuga in this book. Now, there's other type of ways you can look at time cycles and astrological ages, like the zodiacal ages is not something I get into in this book, but I will talk about it in future works, because Manly Hall does have a very interesting take on the move from Pisces to Aquarius. So that's not part of this book. I'm really focusing on the Hindu concept of the Kali Yuga in this book. And so one of the things I discuss is how the Kali Yuga, according to one particular way of dating it, it looks like it's achieving its culmination point at the present day. And this makes sense considering this motion into global civilization, these crises that we're experiencing, the transformations that we're experiencing. And so what that implies as the cycle is moving to its culmination point, the lingering unresolved karma from its whole history, from the past 5,000 plus years that it's been taking place, is like being vacuumed up and expressed in a very concentrated manner as like a grand finale, as a great moment of baptism by fire. And then we have to get to the other side of this, and then we can experience the sort of rebirth that comes with the phoenix archetype. And so all of these things are discussed in this chapter called The Return to the Mystery Schools, but I also discussed them in the introduction that I'm now going to be reading to you, and it's called The Kali Yuga Reaches Its Grand Finale. And so a lot of these things I've just been talking about, I'm going to be discussing in this initial introduction. So without further ado, let's get into it. Once again, this is called The Kali Yuga Reaches Its Grand Finale, and I will be posting a copy of this introduction onto my Substack so you can read it on there. And let's get into it. It begins with the first section. It's got 5 or 6 different sections, and the first one's called The Philosophy of Time Cycles. The great philosophical traditions of world history share one essential teaching in common. God is ever present within creation, fashioning it from his substance and essence, residing in every atom and molecule within it, and driving it towards a final state of evolutionary completion. According to ancient philosophy, the universe is formed as a result of a divine meditation taking place within the mind of God. When God focuses his consciousness inward during this meditation, the universe is born. When God eventually withdraws his consciousness back out and concludes his meditation, the universe disappears. This oscillation between creation and dissolution is part of an eternal pattern of existence, the mystic spiral of the Tao. Creation is yang, dissolution is yin. God forever moves back and forth between the two, the ebb and flow of universal consciousness. Having meditated the universe into existence, God is ever present within its space. It was fashioned for a reason. God is working something out through its evolution. The same is true with the forms and events that arise within the universe. Each exists for a deliberate purpose and holds a special spiritual significance. Therefore, while it may seem from our limited perspective that life is chaotic and random in its motions, in reality the opposite is true. The laws of creation are universally operative. Nothing is out of place, everything has meaning, and in the end, God's plan will triumph. What are the implications of this spiritual worldview for us today? The basic idea is simple. Human beings in the world we inhabit are ideations of a single divine mind, formed as thought patterns within its internal space. As the evolution of life on Earth advances, this divine thought works itself out towards completion. Once a final resolution to the thought is achieved, the divine plan is fulfilled and the form of the world absorbs back into the consciousness of the divine mind. This results in a period of cosmic rest ensuing before eventually a new cycle of meditative activity begins, resulting in the formation of a new cycle of creation. As humans, there are many lessons we can take from this. For one, it emphasizes that we are deliberate creations of God, fashioned for a special reason and purpose. Specifically, we are intended to serve as awakened instruments of God's plan, helping to facilitate its conclusion here on Earth. To achieve this, the indwelling presence of God within us must be awakened and given sovereign control over the lower physical personality. The experience of enlightenment that results from this process is what gives the human being the spiritual wisdom, intelligence, and power they need in order to fulfill their part in the realization of God's plan. The fact that each of us has a unique and personal relationship with God gives meaning and purpose to our lives and offers us hope for the future. The story of human life is not arbitrary. This is true for each person and also for the story of humanity as a whole. The contours of God's plan may not be evident within the boundaries of a single lifetime or historical period, but when you factor in the concept of reincarnation and expand the parameters of your analysis to incorporate multiple lifetimes and historical epochs, then the true scope of the divine plan becomes clear. Creation unfolds within the mind of God in the form of a cycle, with a beginning, middle, and end. There are two dominant motions within this cycle, involution and evolution. Involution involves the projection of God's consciousness from unity to diversity, with the energy of spirit moving down into matter and clothing itself in material form. Evolution is a reversal of this process. Spirit, locked within matter, gradually liberates itself from the confines of material form and reascends back to its source condition of unity. During the initial involution phase of the creation cycle, a diverse ecosystem of differentiated, individualized life forms is created. God injects his consciousness into each of these forms and experiences existence through their eyes. These forms range from simple to complex and extend from the physical to the metaphysical. At one end of the spectrum are simple atoms, molecules, and organisms. At the other are great spiritual beings or gods whose existence is entirely metaphysical. Mankind resides in the middle ground between these two extremes. We have bodies made from the gross matter of the earth and souls comprised of the metaphysical substance of the gods. This duality gives man the capacity to experience both the physical and metaphysical dimensions of creation equally, the earth below and the heavens above. It also gives it the choice to choose which side of itself it will most strongly identify with, its lower material body or its higher spiritual soul. So that's the beginning of the first section. The second section is called The Spiritual Meaning of a Dark Age. Within the creation cycle, the midpoint between its beginning and end marks a period of time when matter's entropic pull against spirit is most strongly felt. The consciousness of the creator falls asleep within the forms it has fashioned, and the selfish concerns of the body and ego grow dominant over those of the higher spiritual self. When this period in the cycle is reached, it's known as a dark age. This comes as a natural and inevitable phase of the creation process, one that the creator's higher mind orchestrates so that its lower bodily forms can experience and learn from its dynamics. Within each creation cycle, there are embedded innumerable subcycles of varying size and duration. Each follows the same core pattern as the master cycle. There is a beginning, middle, and end, with involutionary forces dominating in the first half of the cycle and evolutionary ones in the second half. By implication, each subcycle has its own version of a dark age, as does the larger master cycle that contains them. According to the teachings of ancient philosophy, the great dark age of Earth's master cycle was experienced long ago during the fall of Atlantis. Mankind lived through this experience and has now progressed beyond it. We are on the evolutionary upswing phase of the master cycle. Having passed its nadir point, we are now somewhere on the ascending arch leading upward toward the eventual establishment of a new golden age. While mankind has passed beyond the Great Atlantean Dark Age, there are still subsidiary subcycles along the path of evolutionary ascent we are now on. Each of these has its own miniature Dark Age, and for the past several thousand years the world has fallen into one of these. The Brahmins of ancient India termed this Dark Age the Kali Yuga, naming it after their goddess of initiation, Kali. In their philosophical teachings, they discussed its characteristics extensively and forecasted a timeline for its beginning and end. According to the prophecies of the ancient Hindu philosophers, during the Kali Yuga, civilization will sink into a period of relative spiritual decline, with humanity falling victim to the evil potentials latent within itself. Negative psychological tendencies like materialism, ignorance, egotism, and empire will become endemic, and corruption will continuously destabilize the social order. With the benefit of hindsight, we can see clearly that over the past several thousand years, since these prophecies were originally made, each of the predictions has in one form or another come true. The suffering that mankind endures during a dark age like this is not arbitrary. Rather, the trials and tribulations we experience are highly symbolic and intended to be instructive, informing us where our shortcomings are and what aspects of ourselves we need to develop in order to progress to the next stage of our evolutionary development. In this way, each dark age holds a special spiritual significance. It comes not as a cosmic mistake or divine injustice, but rather as a necessary and inevitable aspect of the creation cycle and of humanity's evolutionary journey within it. The struggle, strife, and despair we encounter during this period are part of a necessary bottoming out phase that must be faced and overcome before the human soul's reascent to a new and higher phase of its growth journey can occur. The philosophers of ancient India were not the only ones who discussed the present dark age in their teachings. Other traditions also had their own names and descriptions of it. For example, American esotericist Manly P. Hall writes of Plato's concept of the Age of Iron. According to Plato, as Hall tells us, quote, "The world is subject to alternating periods of fertility and sterility. Fertility is to be understood as an abundance of life, so that all growth is accelerated. Sterility, by contrast, infers a privation of the life principle. A period of fertility is called a golden age. During such times, arts, philosophies, sciences, and religions flourish, and men live together in a state of concord. After our golden age, the spiritual energies decline, and the world passes into the age of silver, from there into an age of bronze, falling finally into an age of iron, which is the lowest place in the cycle of fertility. Plato's age of iron equates to what the Hindus call the Kali Yuga. It is the nadir phase of a cosmic cycle when the entropic pull of matter is at its strongest and the consciousness-liberating impulse of spirit at its weakest. In periods like this, the destructive tendencies gain domination, and men devote their lives to the gratification of selfishness and ambition. Thus, the least degree of fertility produces the greatest degree of sterility, and all noble institutions languish. And those quotes from Manly Hall are from his book Journey in Truth. The next section is called The Historical Timing of the Kali Yuga. In the Hindu tradition, there is considerable controversy about how to date the beginning, duration, and ending of the Kali Yuga. One widespread interpretation is that it began in 3102 BC and is set to last for a staggering 432,000 years. Critics point out that this number is vastly overinflated, however, and that the Kali Yuga's true duration is much shorter, around 5,000 years, thus falling within the time frame of recorded history. Bibhu Dev Misra, in his recent book Yuga Shift, makes a strong case that the exact duration of the Kali Yuga is 5,701 years, with its starting date coming in 3676 BC rather than 3102 BC, and its end date slated for 2025 AD, aka next year. Misra's timeline makes sense to me for three reasons. And I want to say that I actually just recorded an interview with Bibhu Dev Misra a few days ago, and I'll be posting that soon on the podcast. And we talk the whole time, like over 2 hours, just about the Kali Yuga and the dating of it, and how the various aspects of his dating of it fit into a historical timeline that makes sense. There's some key synchronicities there that suggest that his dating is indeed accurate, or at least the most accurate one that I've seen. All right, so picking back up. First, in Misra's model, the Kali Yuga start date, which again is around 3600 BC, marks the beginning of the period in human history called the Bronze Age, whose civilizations prominently featured the Kali Yuga's archetypal themes in the story of their rise and fall. These include a decline in the wisdom of priesthoods, an increase in the imperial ambitions of monarchies, the idolatrous worship of rulers, the gradual erosion of moral values and social cohesion, and the overuse of environmental resources leading to desperate expansionism and the eventual collapse of civilization. So again, this all happened during the first phase of the Kali Yuga cycle, the rise and fall of Bronze Age civilization. So now we're moving into the midpoint of the cycle. And so this is the second reason I think that his dating of the cycle makes sense, is that the midpoint of the Kali Yuga aligns with the beginning of the Axial Age, when a new wave of oligarch-run empires emerged to dominate the geopolitics of Eurasia. These empires were proto-capitalistic and ruled by rich and powerful dynastic families, who controlled the population through the strategic manipulation of debt. The trend of moral and cultural decline originally seen in earlier Bronze Age civilizations accelerated during this period, with a huge percentage of the population becoming enslaved as a consequence of the perpetual war fighting, pillaging, and plundering of the oligarch-run empires of this period. In the West, the eventual fall of the Roman Empire, the last of these oligarch-run pagan empires, brought about the final collapse of pagandom and set the stage for the modern world order to emerge. And that's kind of what the Middle Ages signifies, the beginning of the modern world order emerging. And then lastly, the reason that his version of the Kali Yuga cycle makes sense to me is because the ending of the Kali Yuga coincides with the crises, opportunities, and transformations of the present moment, with global civilization sitting at the cusp of an epochal shift away from nation states and into global government. Other significant developments occurring today include the emergence of artificial intelligence, the global interconnection of peoples and cultures through the internet, the rise of technocracy as a new governance paradigm, the slow drip revelation of the UFO mystery, a renewed interest in Atlantis and the mysteries of human history, and the possibility of world-altering breakthroughs in science and technology. Accompanying these trends is the outbreak of a series of acute socio-political, psychological, and environmental crises, which have already brought despair and death to millions and which feature strong Armageddon motifs in their symptomology. In the near future, there is also the very real possibility of a major climatic event occurring, caused either by a meteor strike, a shift in the planet's magnetic poles, a major volcanic eruption, or some form of counterreaction by nature to modern civilization's systematic destruction of the environment. It is fitting that the world should experience a time of profound crisis and transformation at the precise moment when the Kali Yuga is prophesied to come to its final end. Furthermore, when we zoom in and analyze the nature of the challenges and opportunities facing mankind today, we discover that their themes are closely connected to trends that have built up and progressed over the course of the Kali Yuga's 5,700-year time cycle, starting with its origin point in the 37th century BC. One of these trends has to do with the gradual secularization of economic management, a trend that began in the Bronze Age, progressed during the Axial Age, and is now reaching its culmination point with the paradigm of quote-unquote late-stage capitalism that we are now in. During the Bronze Age, the management of society's economic institutions shifted out of the hands of the priesthood and fell instead under the control of the state. With this motion, the material organization of society, i.e. the economy, detached from being governed by religious values and instead fell prey to the increasingly secular, greedy, and materialistic motivations of state rulers. As the Kali Yuga progressed, this trend would steadily increase, becoming a dominant theme of the age, with the pursuit of material wealth and power becoming a purpose unto itself, a new secular religion for the ruling elite. Alongside this motion, the institutions of church and state would gradually separate. The traditional caste system fragmented, and cultural infighting became prominent, with competing perspectives and interests developing between the various castes of the social order. In this environment, each caste would succumb to its own worst tendencies, with the aristocracy becoming greedy and obsessed with wealth, the state growing tyrannical and imperialistic, and the priesthood falling into ignorance and superstition. This trend culminated in the final deconstruction of the pagan social order, which occurred around the time of the Axial Age's endpoint during the 5th century AD. So we find the nadir phase, or the midpoint, the low point of the Kali Yuga cycle, coinciding with the complete dissolution of a very ancient pattern of civilization, of a way that social orders were organized for a very long period of time. So it's fitting that should happen at this midpoint. And then from that point, gradually the ascending aspect of the cycle, of the Kali Yuga cycle, is instigated. And this represents the rebuilding of a new social order out of that deconstructed elements of pagan society. And so originally that took form as the social order of the Middle Ages, and that was never really stable, but that gradually evolved upward to becoming modern civilization, which has also never been totally stable, but there has been a progression. There's been an ascent, and through the process of that ascent, there's actually also been a reconnection between the various components of global civilization, to the point that now that we're at the end point of the cycle, we're sitting on the cusp of global government, and but also a transformation in religion, a transformation in science, hopefully a revitalization of philosophy. So again, there's this important synchronistic timing between these key phases of the development of civilization throughout the Kali Yuga, and we can see themes beginning at the beginning of the cycle, going back to the Bronze Age, playing themselves out, and reaching an epigee at the midpoint of the cycle, and then those then are moving forward to today and suggesting their reconstruction and rebirth into something new. So this all makes sense philosophically, and it aligns with what we would expect to find if indeed the timing of the Kali Yuga is as we're putting forward here. Moving on and picking back up here. Now I'm going to be going back into the midpoint of the cycle, which was this Axial Age period. The rise of proto-capitalistic oligarchies at the beginning of the Axial Age is something that played a crucial role in facilitating the deconstruction of the pagan social order. In the West, oligarchy emerged as a byproduct of increased international trade, which supported the rise of powerful merchant banking families. In time, these banded together to form the first oligarchies, which displaced the old pattern of monarchical rule. For reasons we will be discussing in this book, the emergence of oligarchy coincided with the rise of a series of proto-capitalistic empires, of which the Roman Empire is the prototypical example. Part of the reason why has to do with the secret weapon that the oligarchs behind these empires utilized to amass their power, which was the strategic manipulation of debt and the use of usury, which they weaponized to subjugate kings, enslave populations, build extensive fiefdoms, and centralize power and wealth into their hands. And their behaviors, the oligarch-driven empires of the Axial Age perfectly encapsulated the archetypal themes of the Kali Yuga, including materialism, greed, selfishness, hedonism, and degeneration. It's fitting, therefore, that these empires should emerge at the exact midpoint of the Kali Yuga cycle. Keeping the synchronicity in mind, we discovered that these empires and the social destabilization they brought about were no accidents of history. They were instruments of Kali's manifestation, tools that she wielded to bring about the entropic destruction of pagandom, so that a new institutional order could arise from its ashes, one that began in the Middle Ages and has since progressed to become the foundation of modern civilization. When we compare the historical saga of the Axial Age with the archetypal themes of the Kali Yuga, we discover the wisdom in philosopher Manly P. Hall's assessment that pagan civilization's, quote, final corruption was due to the motion of the world from a state of fertility to one of sterility. The outward indication was the increase in the political ambition of governing classes, with resultant wars and internal dissension. There's another crucial aspect of the Axial Age that is not to be overlooked. It is the moment in history when philosophy first emerged as a public-facing institution. Before 600 BC, philosophy was embedded within the institutions of pagan religion and had no separate independent existence. It was preserved by their priesthoods, and in order to gain access to it, one had to join their ranks. But after the 6th century BC, this situation changed, with independent philosophical schools emerging all over the world. These were dedicated to disseminating the same sacred wisdom teachings that the ancient priesthoods once exclusively possessed. But now, detached from temple control, these teachings were given a new body and taught in a new form. This independence was crucial for the future, given that, by this point, the old priesthoods had already begun their descent into corruption. The pending collapse of pagandom's religious institutions was inevitable, but after the emergence of philosophy, their most vital wisdom teachings could now live on in a new institutional form, which was the philosophical school, or the academy. The first philosophical schools emerged at the start of the Axial Age during the 6th century BC. These included the Greek academies of Pythagoras and Plato, the Buddhist school of Gautama Buddha, the Taoist order founded by Lao Tzu in China, the Jain sect in India, the Zoroastrians in Persia, and the cult of Quetzalcoatl in Central America. Altogether, the new institution of philosophy that the Axial Age gave birth to would go on to shape the trajectory of modern civilization in ways that few today truly appreciate. So the next section is called The End of the Kali Yuga Draws Near. Moving up to the present, we are fast approaching the end of the Kali Yuga, with its archetypal themes woven deeply into the pattern of major existential crises now confronting civilization. It's as if the unresolved karma of the past 5,000 years is accumulating, concentrating, and manifesting within a short, intense period of time, a grand finale to the Dark Age. The intense experiences at the ending of this cycle presents to humanity forces it to finally confront and overcome its past failures and shortcomings. In so doing, mankind is enabled to liberate itself from the baggage of the past, so that it can now focus its attention on a new collective goal, building toward the establishment of a new golden age. The institutions that have played major roles in driving the events of the Kali Yuga, particularly those concerning oligarchy, capitalism, and empire, are again involved in the current spate of crises now facing mankind. In the globalized civilization of the future, however, there is no more room for these institutions to persist. Each has played a unique and important role in driving forward the Dharma of the age, but now that it's time for the Kali Yuga to come to its final end, we must transcend the constraints they impose and shed them like an old skin, embracing in their place a new organizing logic for civilization. The world nation that is to come will arise from the deconstruction of the base elements of the modern world order that the empires of the Kali Yuga have catalyzed. Our task is to reconstruct these elements into the foundation of a new globalized form of civilization, the world nation. The world nation that is to come will arise from the deconstruction of the base elements of the modern world order and their reconstruction into the form of a new globalized pattern of civilization. The American Empire is the epicenter of this alchemical project, with the themes of the Kali Yuga playing out in a particularly potent manner through the story of America's rise and fall as global hegemon. As with Rome before it, the pending downfall of America indicates the last gasp of a dying civilization, one that Kali will no longer allow to be carried forward into the world of the future. But unlike with Rome, the death of America will not result in the deconstruction and balkanization of civilization. Rather, America's destiny is to give birth to the world nation, which will arise out of the flame and ash of its decaying empire and emerge as a forward advancement of America's highest ideals. Elaborating on the themes involved with this alchemical death and rebirth process, Manly P. Hall writes that, quote, humanity is now approaching the end of an age of iron, which was Plato's term for the Kali Yuga. Revulsion mechanisms are setting in, and humanity is becoming wary with the sterility of its conditions. In time, this revolt against the limitations of materialism will result in the reestablishment of the Golden Age, that blessed time when the gods walk with men. As we approach the end of the Kali Yuga, civilization will find itself moving out of its previous condition of material sterility and back toward one of spiritual fertility. Hall informs us that this transformation will be supported by an increase of natural vitality, which moves into human life, enlivens it, and begins guiding it toward a new birth in wisdom and truth. This new birth is mankind's reward for successfully overcoming the trials, obstacles, and challenges it faced during the Kali Yuga, which took the form of war, crime, and poverty, all of which must be experienced to the fullest before the mind will reject them in favor of a simpler and more mature course of action. So, next section is called The Dweller on the Threshold. The numerous existential crises now facing mankind together constitute the bodily form of an archetypal adversary, what in the ancient mysteries was called the Dweller on the Threshold. This adversary represents the guardian at the gate, who bars the pathway to transcendence and demands that the candidate successfully confront and overcome its challenge in order to progress to the next stage of their initiation journey. Every initiate of the mysteries was required to face off against this existential adversary. Today, we are being presented with a great collective form of it, with this dweller manifesting as the accumulated sum of the various disasters now facing our civilization. The dweller on the threshold arises out of the repressed shadow tendencies and unresolved negative karma of the initiate themselves. It is a manifestation of their psychological shadow, in other words. The intense pressure of the initiation process provides the alchemical heat necessary to force one's inner impurities outward, projecting them in the form of a shadow adversary. This adversary confronts the initiate as the personification of their worst fears, tendencies, and shortcomings. Faced with this existential threat, the candidate can either shrink from the confrontation and fail their initiation test, or rise to the challenge and use the conflict as a means to liberate themselves from the negative attributes that their shadow adversary is personifying and projecting back at them. In other words, when we confront the dweller as an external foe, we are in actuality confronting an external projection of the inner shadow complexes and evil tendencies we hold within ourselves. Consequently, the only way to defeat this adversary is to vanquish the negative elements within ourselves that it feeds off of. When you cleanse yourself of its fuel source, the dweller ceases its attacks upon you, and you are now prepared to walk through the doorway it guards toward the new birth in wisdom and truth that Manly Hall told us about, and that the mystery schools have been preparing you for and driving you towards. Simply put, the spiritual function of the dweller archetype and the reason the mystery schools harnessed it as an initiation tool is because it forces the candidate to transmute the negative karma they hold within themselves and convert it into positive soul power, which they can then carry forward and use in the next phase of their soul's evolutionary development journey. It's fitting that mankind's great collective confrontation with the dweller archetype should occur at the precise moment the Kali Yuga approaches its final endpoint. Kali has drawn us into her initiation portal with the promise of a great evolutionary leap forward in human civilization possible on the other side of the guardian at the gate now confronting us. In psychological terms, this dweller is the manifestation of what Carl Jung termed the collective shadow. It appears in different forms in different cultures and regions, but today is primarily manifesting through the activities of American Empire. To better understand the nature of the shadow adversary that we are now collectively facing, in this book we're going to delve deep into the history, mechanics, and endgame of American Empire, overviewing how it's structured, what its internal mechanics are, how it has evolved through time, what its current form looks like, and where within its body the shadow has taken hold. In other words, we're going to shine a light on regions of American society that have not yet seen the light of public awareness, and in so doing, we're going to set the stage for a social and psychological process of reintegration and self-transformation to occur. From an alchemical perspective, this book offers a deconstruction of the Pax Americana, stripping it down to its base elements and showing how each component can be cleansed, purified, and reassembled in the effort of forming a new paradigm of global government from their union, one that will be rooted in the Platonic ideal of the world nation. All right, the last section is called The Resurrection of the Mysteries and the Archetype of the Phoenix. The psychological function of the shadow is to conceal the light of the self within. In other words, the indwelling presence of divinity within the human soul. Within the heart of American empire, beyond many layers of shadow activity that surround it, there is an institutional equivalent of this principle of the self. A sacred organization dedicated to serving the indwelling presence of divinity within human civilization. The hierarchs of this institution hold a direct connection in consciousness with the spirit world above. Like the bodhisattvas of Buddhism, they have pledged themselves to the task of guiding mankind toward the eventual attainment of its evolutionary completion. Theosophists call the institution that houses these sages and wise men the Great White Lodge. The Rosicrucians of the Middle Ages called it the Invisible College. It is a mystery school, and one of its key symbols, the all-seeing eye, can be found on the US dollar bill. In every age of civilization, this esoteric spiritual institution has existed. It is perennial, with its eternal home residing in the etheric fields that pervade and permeate the planet. From this ethereal headquarters, its hierarchs administer a network of terrestrial institutions, which collectively serve as the outer gateways to its invisible inner structure. These terrestrial gateways into the mysteries take different forms in different ages. In the heyday of classical civilization, they resided within the inner sanctums of the pagan religious temples. Back then, its existence was more widely known and accepted, with its initiates occupying key positions of influence within the overt power structures of ancient society. Over the course of the Kali Yuga, however, this situation changed, and gradually the mystery schools and their terrestrial ambassadors disappeared from public view. The Great White Lodge never ceased existing. It merely shifted from an active to passive involvement in the affairs of society, working from deep behind the scenes rather than out on the surface. As we move toward the end of Kali's initiation portal, one of our key tasks is to rediscover the concealed existence of this institution and call upon it, drawing upon its resources and guidance to aid us in achieving our victory over the Dweller, who bars our passage to a better world beyond. Situated next to the archetypal symbol of the mystery schools, the all-seeing eye on the dollar bill, is the image of an eagle. As I discussed in my book on Manly P. Hall, this eagle is actually a concealed phoenix, which in the lore of esoteric philosophy symbolizes the spiritual rebirth of the initiate, who dies to their former self in order to be psychologically reborn into a higher and more awakened state of existence. The ritual of the phoenix is something every initiate must undergo during their passage through the initiation degrees of the mysteries. It reproduces on the level of the mind the natural creative destruction processes of Mother Nature, in which evolution brings about the death of an old form so that a new and higher soul vehicle can arise in its place. The flames that engulf and consume the phoenix as it undergoes its death-rebirth ritual symbolize the baptism by fire that each human inevitably experiences during key phases of their evolutionary development. The mystery schools, in their initiation degrees, concentrate and amplify this natural evolutionary process, thereby quickening the pace of the spiritual development of their initiates. At a key phase of their disciples' initiation process, the hierarchs of the mysteries orchestrate an experiential confrontation with the Dweller, the purpose being to use this encounter as a quickening agent to catalyze the spiritual transformation of their initiates. Because of its association with initiation, the phoenix should be understood as yet another archetypal symbol of the mystery schools. Its inclusion on the dollar bill alongside the all-seeing eye is therefore an indication that the mysteries are currently active within America. Located within a concealed vantage point at the heart of American empire, this esoteric institution has been quietly working to guide mankind through Kali's initiation portal and toward its rebirth into a new paradigm of global government. The overt structures driving American empire, the so-called deep state or shadow government, surround and conceal this mystery school. They exist as manifestations of the collective shadow and embody the archetype of the dweller on the threshold. In other words, they personify the guardian at the gate which barricades mankind's great leap forward into a new and better world beyond. In the coming years, the manifestation of the dweller within America will engulf its nation, its empire, and its vassal colonies in a great pyre of flame. This event may or may not coincide with the synchronistic emergence of environmental catastrophes. Either way, the archetypal themes of the Armageddon will emerge, after which point a great transformation in world civilization will occur. This will involve the collective rebirth of society into the form of a new world nation, which will alchemically rise out of the deconstructed elements of the world's last great empire, America. The arrival of this world nation will signify the formal ending of the Kali Yuga and herald the beginning of a new cycle of human development, one that will eventually result in the establishment of a new golden age on Earth. So that's the end of this introductory section. And this idea of the golden age it's an archetype. It has to do, once again, with this idea of time cycles. So if there's a dark age, then there has to be the corollary of that, which is an age of light or a golden age. And so that's, by definition, as we're moving towards the culmination of the Kali Yuga, there'll be a period of symbolic significance marking the ending of that phase. I term this an initiation portal. And then eventually we'll pass beyond that and then begin a motion of ascent. And that ascent culminates in the idea of a golden age. And a golden age is marked by a state of consciousness. It's not just a material state of organization, but it's a society that gives birth to a new state of consciousness that's global, that's spiritually aware, that's facilitating the evolution of the soul, the integration of the self. So that's the introduction to the book. And then the contents of that book, as I was hinting at here in this introduction, the contents of it are really about externalizing the inner features and the inner mysteries of American Empire. Because as I argue, American Empire is the vehicle of the collective shadow at the moment. And philosophically, it's the manifestation of the dweller on the threshold. So, the deep state and the various components of it, which are running this global empire that's so destructive and extractive and that's corrupting so many different aspects of human society and human culture, and that's responsible for eroding the environment with its economics, that empire, there's a symbolic significance to it. And there's also a important timing to its emergence that has to do with these themes of death and rebirth. And I'll also point out something I mentioned in previous episodes is that at the present moment, when American Empire is sort of coming into this transformation point, this also coincides with the time of America's Pluto return. And the Pluto return very much has to do with these themes of the phoenix and of death and rebirth, and sort of a bubbling up of karma with the idea of having to address the shadow roots of it, the psychological shadow roots of it within yourself. So I'll leave you with that for now. I will be back to announce the launch of the book when it comes out in a few weeks. I'll also have some more excerpts that I'm going to share, and then I have a whole bunch of articles and podcasts that I'll do in support of this book that'll delve more into the details of certain things that are going on today that tie into the themes of the book. And so there's a lot of work to be done. I've been sitting on a lot of material waiting for this book to come out. So I'll be much more active now. Now that the book is going to be released, I'll be much more active on the podcast and on my Substack. And hopefully I'll be doing some, scheduling some major interviews and sharing this perspective with a larger audience. But I appreciate everybody who's been tuning in. And I hope you'll, go through this journey with me to explore these ideas. I think it's definitely, the timing is right to break ground on this. So anyway, thanks very much. Again, this is Alex Sakin, the Wisdom Tradition Podcast, and God bless.